Refactoring our bar chart has given it polish on the inside. But if you're not an engineer, you don't see that. You just see what's on the outside. Now it's time to polish it on the outside by giving it some nice visual style. What do we have here anyway? We've got black text, black bars with no spacing in between, and these black lines in the background. And we're using the default font. All of these things can be tweaked to give it a more professional and visually appealing look. I personally don't feel like I'm that good of a visual designer, so I like to turn to external resources like the Sunlight Foundation Data Visualization Style Guide. These data visualization style guidelines by Amy Cecil are just amazing. They tell you exactly where to put the title, what fonts to use, how to space things, what colors to use, what the base colors are for text and lines, and what the brand colors are. There's a ton of good stuff in here, but what I'm going to use this for mainly are the colors. Take, for example, this line gray accent color. I'm going to copy this hex color code out of here, and I'm going to use it as the color of our background lines. I'll start by forking this one and renaming it to Stylized bar chart. So what do we want to style here anyway? It's those lines that are part of axis bottom. It's these lines right here. The stroke is black, but it might as well be, and boom, I can paste that color right there. Might as well be this nice gray color. That right there makes a pretty big impact. These lines fade to the background rather than being really stark against the white background. This is one way we can do the styling, but another way we could do it, which I consider the preferable way, is to use CSS. CSS was designed just for styling, and doing this stuff in CSS rather than inline in our JavaScript means that we can change all the theme styles in one place in the CSS, and we don't need to jump around between all the various files. Instead of setting the stroke here, we can use CSS, and the way that we can interface to CSS from here is by setting a class on our stuff. Our tick marks have a predictable structure where there's a single line element and a single text element inside of these group elements. Therefore, maybe a good place to start would be to give a class to our group element. Maybe we can call it tick. This is how you would do it in HTML, but there's a gotcha when using React and JSX that you can't use class like this. You have to use class name instead. Now, if we inspect these elements here, we can see that our group elements have a class of tick. Now we can go over into our CSS. Over in index.html, we've already got this style tag with some CSS here. What I can do is add a rule here that applies to our tick lines. We can use .tick to select the group elements that have a class of tick, space line to select all line elements that are children of those group elements with a class of tick. And on these elements, we can set, I'm going to paste what I had before, we can set the stroke to be, and we need to change this syntax to be CSS instead of JavaScript, like this. Now these lines again show up to be that same color. All right, we have styled our grid lines. Now we can apply the same technique to everything else. What should we address next? I think this black text on a white background is too stark, and I'd like to use the color from the style guide for the text. To select the text elements in our tick group elements, we can say .tick space text. And here, to set the color, I believe we can say fill, and I'll just set it to red just to check if it works. Okay, that works. The thing's turned red. But red is not what we want. I'm going to go to the style guide to see what that text color would be. We've got text main and text light. I think I'll use text light. So I'll copy this hex code here and paste it over here in place of red. All right, that worked, but only for one of our axes. That's because in this axis, namely axis left, I don't think we're setting the class. So let me just take this logic that sets the class name of tick on axis bottom and apply it as well to axis left. Oh, it looks like these are just text elements. Well, from the CSS perspective, it would be convenient if they were inside of group elements. So I think I'll just make group elements with the class name of tick to contain these text elements. All right, that worked. But you know, now that I see this, it looks a bit too faded. Let me try a different color. Maybe let's try text main. I'll copy this here and paste it over here. All right, that looks a little better. All right, we've set the color of our tick text. I don't quite like this default font. I don't know what font this is, but I just don't like it. Nowadays, probably the easiest way to set fonts is to use Google Fonts. There are tons of fonts in here, for example, Poppins. I've come to like this font quite a lot, so you can say, select this font when you found a font that you like, and then click down here. And this little window here gives you snippets that you can copy-paste into your code. This link snippet pulls in the font, and this can go in the head of your HTML. I'll put it right here before our style tag. There it is. And also in this little pop-up, it shows you how you can use it. You can just set the font family like this. So I'll copy that, go over to here, and I'll just leverage the cascading nature of CSS to have everything on the page use that font by putting the font family in the body. Now everything on the page gets that font. Now if we take a look in detail, you can see that it's using this new font. Lastly, I'd like to set the color of the bars and maybe space them apart a little bit. The style guide has a section called data colors. This color here looks pretty nice. I think I'll use it. I'll copy that hex code and then go over to our code. And going with the philosophy that the style should be defined in CSS, I'm going to presume that we will give a class of mark to our marks. And then we can set the fill of our marks to be that color. But we didn't give the class mark to our marks, so let's do that. We can go to marks.js, and for each of these rectangles, we can say class name equals mark. And boom, we've got this nice color. All right, that's how you can change the color of marks with CSS. The last thing I'd like to do is spread apart these bars and maybe move the CSS into its own separate file. The thing that controls the spacing between the bars is the Y scale. The Y scale is not defined in here though, it's defined in index.js right here, and it's an instance of scale band. If you ever need to know what options are available on scale band, you can just Google it and be sure to click on D3 scale. This is the project in GitHub where all the documentation lives. And then on this page, I'm going to search for scale band. This diagram is really useful for us right now because it says, okay, this is padding inner, the space between the bars, and this is padding outer, the space between the edge of our inner rectangle and the bars. Scrolling down a bit, we come upon the definitions of padding inner, padding outer, and padding, which just sets the inner and outer padding. I think this is the one I'd like to use. To bring that to life for our Y scale, we can just add another line using method chaining and say dot padding. And here we can pass in some value like 0.1. All right, that gives us some nice spacing. See, a value of 0.5 here makes it an even split between empty and full space. So I kind of like the lower values like 0.1, 0.2, 0.15 perhaps. And just to see what it would look like, what if I just say padding inner? Now there are no gaps on the top and the bottom, and actually I kind of like the way that this looks. All right, that's how we can add some space in between the bars. Now what's remaining is just minor cleanup. The balance of white space doesn't quite feel right. Like this U is quite close to the edge, and this is quite close to the bottom, while there's some empty space on the top and the right. To address those, I'll just modify the margin a little bit. I'll increase the left margin just a bit, and the bottom margin as well. And maybe I'll increase the right margin just a tad. All right, that's looking pretty good, but it just dawned on me that just by looking at this image, you have no idea what these numbers mean. Maybe we could add a nice big label on the bottom that says population. In the code that renders our axes and our marks, let me add a text label right here. Text, not text, and then this text should be population. Now this is showing up right there, but I'd like it to show up in the middle on the bottom. To do that, we can set the x coordinate to be inner width divided by 2, since it has to be in the middle of our inner rectangle. There we go, but the alignment is not quite right. See, it's with respect to the bottom left side of this text, but I want the text to be centered. I always forget how to do that, so I always need to Google it. SVG text align. Oh yeah, it's text anchor. Text anchor can be start, middle, or end. So let me try that. Text anchor equals middle. All right, awesome. It moved over a little bit. Now it's centered. Instead of having this at the top, though, I'd like it to be on the bottom. To make that happen, we can set the y coordinate of this text element to be inner height. Now we just need to move it down a little bit to be below these numbers. To do that, I'll just add some number here, like 30. All right, now it's pretty much where I want it to be, but I'd like that label to be bigger. Since we're doing all the styling in CSS, I'm going to accomplish that by first giving this text element a class. Name of, let's call it axis-label. Now that we've got this class set up, we can go over to our CSS, which is getting a bit long now, and add a new rule to select the elements that have a class of axis-label, and we can set their font size to be, say, 2EM, or maybe 2.5. EM, by the way, is a unit that is relative to what its normal size would be. So 1 EM, it looks like the same size as everything else, and 2 EM is double that. 2.5 EM is 2.5 times that. So that looks about right size-wise. The black color is a bit harsh, so I think I'll just use the same fill as we're using for the tick text and apply that to the axis label as well. Very good. That's looking pretty good, but things are just overlapping a bit. So let me just make some tweaks so that things don't overlap. We can change the bottom margin to make more room. And I feel like I want to be able to tweak the x-axis label offset from right here where the margin is defined. So I'll define that as a new variable, and I'll set it to, say, 40. And then down where we are rendering the axis label, instead of hard coding this value of 35, we can use that variable instead. X-axis label offset. Now we can go back to its definition and tweak it to our heart's content. A value of 50 looks about right, but it's a bit too close to the bottom now, so I'll just tweak the bottom margin once more. All right, that's looking pretty good. This is the process of iteration, meaning making little tweaks and changes just to polish things up. And there's one last change I'd like to make here, and that's to do with how the numbers are represented. These numbers here on the bottom are not really formatted at all. At the very least, I would expect there to be commas in the thousands places. And what's even worse than that is I don't think these are even accurate. This says that the population of China is approximately 1.4 million. But I think it's actually 1.4 billion. Yeah, population of China is 1.4 billion. On the original dataset page, there's a little footnote that says figures are presented in thousands. So, to make our population numbers accurate, we need to multiply by 1,000 right here. Now these numbers are accurate, but they're still not nicely formatted. D3 format has a lot of nice utilities for formatting numbers. For example, if we have this number, we can see some example number formatters, and I think this one is closest to what we're after. This is a really nice piece by Zan Armstrong. I think it's actually more popular than the official documentation, which is similar, but it looks kind of like this. I think this is what we want. SI prefix with 2 significant digits sounds pretty good. So we can take this logic here, and we can apply it to our axis. This is going to be in axis bottom, and right now we're just presenting the tick value as is. To keep this axis bottom component rather generic, I'd like to take as input another prop here called format, or rather, how about tick format? Then when we render our tick value, instead of just rendering the value directly, we can pass it into the tick format function. The idea is that this tick format function will return a string that nicely formats this number. Over in index.js, where we invoke axis bottom, we can specify tick format to be, and this is where I can paste that logic from the D3 documentation. In keeping with the way that we are organizing our code here, instead of invoking d3.format, I'm going to just use format, and to do that we need to import format from D3 right here along with all of these other D3 imports. All right, now that we're passing in format.toS, which returns a function that takes as input a number and formats it, now that we're passing that into tick format, we are in fact getting these nicely formatted numbers here. 200 million, 400 million, 600 million, 800 million, 1.0 G? I guess that means billion. G is the SI standard for billion, but I'm not sure people would get that, you know? I'd like to handle that as a special case and use B instead of G to represent billion. The way we can do that is use a custom function that takes as input some number, I'll call it n, and returns format of 2n of that number, and now we're back to where we were. But now that we have this return value available to us as a string, we can use JavaScript's built-in .replace method on strings. The first argument of replace is the thing that we want to replace, namely G, and the second argument is the thing that we want to replace it with, namely B. So now this is taking the string returned from here and just replacing G with B, and then what's returned from the .replace method on the string is the new string that has G replaced by B. Now we have B's here instead of G's. This is not exactly performant though, because it's invoking this for each and every tick, and it's just a lot of logic to have inside of our rendering logic. So I think I'll just, for the sake of cleanliness and performance, I'll split this logic out into a variable called x-axis tick format. And I'll define that at the top of the file, const x-axis tick format equals, and I'll paste that logic right there. This setup still creates the formatting function each time it's invoked. To avoid that, I'll split out this piece to, let's say, SI format, and we can define SI format to be this formatter here. So now this line produces the SI formatter, and this line invokes the SI formatter, produces that string, replaces G with B, and returns that string for each n, for each of our tick values. Actually, let me just call that tick value for the sake of consistency with our other function. Now that's perhaps more clear. All right, now when we look at this in detail, it's accurate and the numbers are nicely formatted. 1.4b, as in billion, is this line here. China is slightly above it, and India is slightly below it. And the US is way down here at a measly, I don't know, 350 million. Notice how it's hard to say exactly what the number is, for example, for the United States. Wouldn't it be so cool if I could just hover over this bar and it would tell me what the population is? In SVG, we can add simple native tooltips by doing the following. For each rectangle, I'm going to open the rect tag and also close it. And inside of here, if you put a title element and then put some text inside of here like hello, then if you hover over this, it says hello. This is a very simple way to make tooltips. Instead of hello, we could put x value of d, and that has to be inside curly braces. Now if we hover, it tells us that number, but it's not nicely formatted. Let's add a new prop called tooltip format, and we can pass the x value of d into there, and we can accept tooltip format as another prop. Then over in index.js, where we invoke our marks component, we can set tooltip format to be x-axis tick format. Now when we hover, we get a nicely formatted number. So I can go back to my narrative and say, China has population 1.4 billion, India has a population of around 1.4 billion, and the US has a population of around 330 million. Really puts things in perspective, doesn't it? I mean, China and India are so much bigger than all the other countries. Pretty wild. But anyway, that's all for stylized bar chart.